On the morning of August 16, 1944, one of the most decorated soldiers in the entire German war machine stood in a damp concrete bunker near the village of Fontaine-le-Temps and read an order that bore no relationship to the world outside. The world outside was mud and fire and screaming horses and 100,000 men trying to pour through a gap barely 2 miles wide before the jaws of an Allied encirclement snapped shut forever. The order said, "Hold position. Counterattack." His name was Paul Hausser. He was 64 years old. He wore a black eye patch over the socket where his left eye had been, lost to a Russian shell fragment during the fighting outside Moscow in the winter of 1941. The men of the Waffen-SS called him Papa, the father of the SS, the architect of the fighting force Hitler had built around his personal bodyguard. He was a Prussian officer of the old school, born in 1880 into a military family in Brandenburg an der Havel, commissioned as a lieutenant at the age of 19, a veteran of the First World War, a man who had spent his entire adult life absorbing and practicing the art of warfare. He was not a man who spooked easily. He was not a man given to sentimentality or panic. But the telegram in his hand was not a military order. It was a death warrant with a bureaucratic heading. Hausser looked at his map table. The acetate overlay told a story that Hitler's telegram refused to acknowledge. He commanded the German 7th Army, on paper a terrifying force of roughly 100,000 men, incorporating the remnants of several elite SS panzer divisions. In reality, those men were pressed into a collapsing rectangle of Norman countryside barely 15 miles wide and 9 miles deep, with the Allied noose drawing tighter by the hour. The Canadian First Army was hammering down from the north, the American 15th Corps was grinding up from Argenton in the south, the 1st Polish Armored Division, fighting with a ferocity born of everything the Germans had done to their country, was closing the only viable exit to the east, near Chambois. And Hitler, sitting more than 1,000 miles away in his underground command bunker at Rostenburg, was demanding a counterattack. Hausser was not the first German general in this war to receive an order that existed only in the Führer's mind. He would not be the last. But he was one of the few who was willing to crumple it up and act on his own judgment. He had done it before. At Kharkov in 1943, he had defied Hitler's explicit orders and pulled his corps out of the city to avoid encirclement, the decision that initially enraged Hitler, but ultimately saved thousands of SS soldiers who would go on to fight effectively for another year. He had made the calculation then that a living army is more valuable than a dead one. He made it again now. He looked at his staff. He gave the order they all knew had to come. "We move tonight," he told them. "We must reach the Dives River before dawn." He could not have known what was waiting for them on the roads ahead. He could not have known that the Americans had prepared something for his army that had never been used on such a scale before, something that would transform the sky into a hammer, turn the air itself into a weapon, and eliminate the one survival trick that every veteran soldier had learned to rely on. He could not have known that somewhere 10 miles away, in a canvas tent behind Allied lines, a young American officer with a slide rule and a synchronized wristwatch was preparing to deliver a physics lesson that 100,000 German soldiers would never forget. To understand how Paul Hausser's army ended up in this particular trap, you have to go back 6 weeks to the last days of July 1944. The Normandy campaign had been grinding since June 6th. The Allied landings had succeeded, but the breakout from the beachhead had been brutally slow. The dense hedgerow country of Normandy, called the bocage, turned every lane and every field into a fortified killing ground. German defenders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, used the landscape with enormous skill. Allied casualties were heavy. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. There were serious concerns in the Allied High Command that the campaign was turning into the kind of static slaughter that had defined the First World War. Then, on July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra. The attack opened with a massive aerial bombardment along the Perrier-Saint-Lô highway, unleashing more than 4,000 aircraft on a narrow strip of German defenses. The German lines cracked. The 7th Corps of the American First Army punched through, and within days the breakout that every Allied planner had dreamed of was underway. General George Patton's Third Army swept west and then south and east in a great wheeling motion, racing through the Norman countryside at speeds that left German commanders scrambling to keep up. By early August, American forces had liberated Le Mans and were swinging north toward Argentan. The Canadians and British were pushing south toward Falaise. The shape of a giant encirclement was becoming visible on every map at every level of command. Hitler's response was to order a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, aimed at cutting the American corridor at Avranches and splitting the Allied forces. It was a bold concept in theory and a catastrophe in practice. The Americans had been forewarned through decoded German radio transmissions. The attack was contained and then shattered. The failure of Lüttich did not just cost the Germans men and tanks. It pushed the bulk of Army Group B, 2 full armies, the 7th and the remnants of the 5th Panzer, deep into the very trap the Allies were building around them. By August 16th, when Hausser stood in his bunker reading Hitler's impossible order, the Germans were caught in what his own chief of staff later described as looking disturbingly similar to the shattered diamond at Stalingrad, only smaller, more compressed, more exposed. The retreat that Hausser ordered on the night of August 16th was not a withdrawal. It was an attempt to funnel an entire army through a bottle that was being held shut by the 1st Polish Armored Division on one side and American forces on the other. The roads leading toward Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives were packed with everything the 7th Army possessed. And what it possessed revealed something fundamental about the German war machine that Nazi propaganda had spent 5 years carefully concealing. Alongside the fearsome 60-ton Tiger II tanks of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, the pinnacle of German engineering, machines that could destroy any Allied tank at combat range, there were thousands upon thousands of horse-drawn wagons. Carts hauling ammunition, carts hauling food, carts carrying wounded men. The German army that had terrified the world in 1939 and 1940 had done so with its armored fist, but the body behind that fist was still largely driven by oats and hay. Of the 322 German Army and SS divisions in existence in November 1943, only 52 were armored or motorized. A standard German infantry division of the period moved on roughly 5,300 horses and 1,100 horse-drawn vehicles. The legendary Blitzkrieg was built on a 20th century armored spearhead attached to a 19th century logistical spine, and in the crush of the Falaise Pocket, that spine was breaking. The roads to Chambord became parking lots of the condemned. Men of the 277th Infantry Division marched with rotting boots and hollow eyes, scanning the sky for the Allied fighter bombers, the Jabos, that ruled the daylight hours. Every time an engine was heard overhead, the column would freeze, thousands of men throwing themselves into the hedgerows and ditches. Officers in Kubel wagons drove up and down the stalled lines, screaming at tank commanders to clear the bridges, trying to separate the armored vehicles from the horse teams so that anything with a motor had a chance of making it through. The air smelled of wet wool, engine oil, and horse manure. It smelled of fear, and it was about to smell of something much worse. 10 miles behind the Allied front lines, in a large canvas tent that could have been a field hospital or a cartography station, there was no mud and no screaming. The men who worked here wore clean uniforms. They drank coffee that was still hot. They spoke in calm, measured tones. They used slide rules and logarithm tables. They were not warriors in any traditional sense. They were engineers of destruction, and the machine they were operating was the most sophisticated killing system that industrial civilization had yet produced. This was the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, of the American 15th Corps Artillery, and it represented something that German High Command fundamentally misunderstood about the nature of American military power. The German conception of artillery was essentially Napoleonic at its core, dressed up in 20th century steel. Each battery calculated its own firing data. Each gun crew operated with a degree of independence. It was a system that valued individual skill and tactical judgment at the battery level. It worked. German artillery had been genuinely effective throughout the war, but it was slow, and in 1944, slow was fatal. The Americans had built something entirely different. The Fire Direction Center centralized everything. One brain, a coordinated network of officers with slide rules and communications equipment, controlled dozens of guns positioned across miles of terrain. The system reduced the time from a fire mission request to shells leaving the barrel from the German standard of 15 to 20 minutes down to as little as 3. Any target on the map could be addressed almost immediately. The battlefield was not a terrain feature to be navigated, it was a factory floor to be managed. German soldiers were not enemies to be outfought, they were raw material to be processed. And fueling this machine was a logistics operation of a scale that still defies easy comprehension. The Red Ball Express, a continuous one-way convoy system of nearly 6,000 trucks running day and night on roads closed to all other traffic, delivered an average of 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. The trucks were driven almost entirely by Black American soldiers, men who had been largely shut out of combat rules by the institutionalized racism of the American military, but who drove those roads with extraordinary courage, often running their routes under fire, and without whom the advance across France would have been impossible. Patton himself acknowledged that the 2.5-ton GMC truck was his most valuable weapon. His son-in-law, Colonel John Eisenhower, went further and said the advance could not have been made at all without those drivers. For every shell that Hausser's artillery could fire, the Americans could return 50. But the Americans had learned something even more important than volume. They had learned something that was about to change the fundamental calculus of survival on a World War II battlefield. The technique was called time on target, abbreviated TOT, and it was one of the most elegant and devastating ideas in the history of warfare. Here is the problem the TOT was designed to solve. In any conventional artillery bombardment, the enemy has warning. Battery A fires a shell. That shell travels for 30, 40, 50 seconds before it hits. In that time, the enemy hears the gun, hears the shriek of the incoming round, dives into foxholes or behind cover, buttons up tanks, gets low. When the shell lands, most of the potential casualties had already protected themselves. Then Battery B fires, and Battery C fires, but by now the enemy is underground and the killing efficiency of each subsequent shell has dropped by as much as 2/3 compared to that first round. Every experienced soldier in the world, including every veteran of the Eastern Front packed into the Falaise Pocket, had internalized this rhythm at a bone-deep level. You heard the gun, you hit the dirt. That 10-second window between the bang and the impact was the difference between living and dying. It was the most reliable survival instinct in modern warfare. The Americans decided to remove the window entirely. The concept of time on target had been developed and refined in the North African campaign in 1941 and 1942, initially by the British, who used BBC radio time signals to synchronize their artillery watches to the second. The Americans picked up the technique and industrialized it with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to everything else. By 1944, TOT was a standard doctrine in both American and Allied fire plans, regularly coordinating hundreds of guns in a single synchronized strike. Here is the mathematics of it, because the mathematics matter. Imagine 3 batteries positioned at different distances from the same target. Battery A is 12 miles away with 155mm howitzers, heavy guns, long range, with a shell flight time at that distance of roughly 48 seconds. Battery B is just over 4 miles away with 105mm howitzers, lighter, quicker, with a flight time of around 18 seconds. Battery C is 8 miles out with heavy 8-inch guns and a flight time of 35 seconds. In a conventional bombardment, all 3 batteries fire at the same moment. The shells arrive 18 seconds apart, staggered and useless, each one giving the enemy time to react to the previous impact. In a time-on-target mission, the FDC works the problem backwards. The goal is to determine not when to fire, but when each battery must fire so that all shells arrive at the exact same moment. Battery A fires first, its shells already in flight for 30 seconds when Battery C releases. And Battery C's rounds have been airborne for 17 seconds when Battery B finally pulls the lanyards. Every projectile crosses the finish line together. The standard military requirement for a TOT strike is plus or minus 3 seconds from the designated time of impact. In practice, American FDC officers were operating to within 1 second.
To achieve that, every artillery officer in the Corps synchronized his watch every single morning to the BBC Greenwich Mean Time signal, holding the watch to his ear and adjusting the second hand pulse by pulse. A deviation of 2 seconds from the master signal was considered a mission failure.
This was the invisible mathematics of American precision, men in tents 10 miles from the front, doing homework with slide rules and copy-stained logarithm tables, calculating the exact moment that hundreds of steel projectiles, weighing between 30 and 200 pounds each, needed to leave their barrels so that they would converge simultaneously on a single point in space and time. To a German observer watching from a hillside, a TOT barrage would look strange, almost lazy. A pop here, a distant thud, a series of seemingly unrelated discharges scattered across the landscape, spread over more than 30 seconds of real time. No rolling thunder, no obvious coordination, nothing to indicate that anything catastrophic was incoming. Which is precisely the point, because the shells were already in the air. Hundreds of them, converging from multiple directions at supersonic speeds, outrunning their own sound. The soldiers at the target had no warning. There was no whistle of incoming. There was no sound at all. And then everything happened at once. The physics of a time-on-target impact zone create an effect that is fundamentally different from a conventional bombardment.
When hundreds of high-explosive shells detonate simultaneously in a confined area, they don't just throw shrapnel, they create an overpressure wave, a sudden, violent compression of air that acts like a solid hammer on everything in its radius. Lungs rupture, eardrums are destroyed, internal organs shear from the shock wave alone before a single fragment has touched a body. The 10-second survival window that soldiers had learned to rely on simply does not exist. The foxhole offers no warning because there was no warning to be heard. One moment a soldier was standing at a crossroads eating cold rations. The next moment he was gone. German prisoners of war captured throughout the Normandy campaign gave consistent testimony about what TOT strikes did to them. Interrogation reports describe men breaking down completely, veterans of Stalingrad, men who had survived the worst the Eastern Front could offer, weeping in the aftermath of a time-on-target barrage. They could fight a tank, they could fight a man, they could not fight mathematics. But TOT was not even the worst of what awaited Hausser's retreating columns. The Americans had a second innovation that had been kept secret with nearly the same level of classification as the Manhattan Project and the planning for D-Day itself. It was called the VT fuze, the variable time fuse, and it did something that soldiers had never had to contend with before. From the earliest days of artillery, the fundamental survival response to an incoming shell was to get below ground level. Shells hit the earth and exploded. The dirt absorbed enormous amounts of the blast energy. The shrapnel flew outward and upward. A soldier in a foxhole, a soldier in a slit trench, was largely protected from a conventional impact-fused shell. This was doctrine. This was basic survival. Every soldier who had served in the field knew it. Every instinct screamed, get low, get underground, get behind anything solid. The scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, working under Merle Tuve and funded by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, had spent the early years of the war building something that eliminated that option entirely. The VT fuse was a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver packed into the nose of an artillery shell. The shell emitted a continuous radio pulse as it fell. When that pulse bounced off the ground below and returned to the shell's receiver at a specific frequency, corresponding to a distance of approximately 30 feet above the surface, the shell detonated, automatically, perfectly, without any need for timing calculations or observer corrections. This was a staggering engineering achievement. The fuse had to survive being fired from an artillery gun, an acceleration shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity, combined with a spin rate of 25,000 revolutions per minute inside the rifled barrel. The components had to keep working at temperatures from minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 100. The whole device, including miniaturized vacuum tubes that hadn't even been conceptualized for this application before the war, had to fit into a space the size of a pint milk bottle.
Over 100 American factories eventually produced more than 22 million of them, at a cost equivalent to roughly $15 billion in today's money. The project was classified at the same level as the atomic bomb. Captured German soldiers were instructed to report VT fuse debris immediately if they ever found it. The reason for the secrecy was obvious. An air-burst shell exploding 30 feet above the ground doesn't just kill men in the open, it kills men in foxholes. The shrapnel pattern from an overhead detonation rains straight down. Trenches become death traps. The foxhole that had been the soldier's most reliable refuge for 100 years of modern warfare became the most dangerous place on the battlefield. Tanks were vulnerable too. The heavy frontal armor that made German Tigers and Panthers so formidable in a direct engagement was useless against 155mm shells exploding above their engine decks, raining steel down through the thinner top armor, destroying radiators and transmission housings, concussing crews through the steel walls with shockwaves that rang the tank like a bell. The Allied command had actually withheld VT fuse shells from use against ground targets for most of 1944, terrified that a dud round might be recovered and reverse-engineered by German scientists. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would force their hand and see the VT fuse deployed on a massive scale for the first time. But limited use had already been made in the Normandy fighting, and the Falaise Pocket was one of the killing grounds where VT-fused artillery combined with time-on-target barrages to create an effect that survivors would struggle to describe in any language. For the men of Hausser's retreating army, packed onto the roads and into the fields around Chambois and Troon and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, what happened next had no precedent in their experience of war. The forests exploded overhead. The trees became wood chippers, shredded by steel that fell from the sky rather than rising from the earth. There was nowhere to run that offered shelter because the shelter had been scientifically designed away. Horses, maddened by the noise and the shrapnel, stampeded through the packed columns, crushing the wounded underfoot. Drivers abandoned their vehicles and ran blindly into the open fields, only to find the next grid square already targeted by the rotating TOT schedule that the FDC was running at 3 barrages per hour, each one shifted to a new position so that there was no safe ground and no predictable rhythm. The corridor between Tron and Chambois became known then and later as the Corridor of Death. The Dives River ran red with blood. The stench of death was so overwhelming that Allied pilots reported smelling the battlefield from hundreds of feet in the air. On August 20th, the mathematics caught up with Paul Hausser personally. He was moving with the remnants of his command staff near the banks of the Dives, trying to coordinate a breakout with the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, Hitler's own personal guard formation, now fighting its last battle in Normandy. He was on foot or in an open vehicle, the accounts vary, but the detail that doesn't vary is this. He was near a crossroads that had been designated a fire mission target. A time-on-target barrage came in without warning. A piece of shrapnel, jagged and still hot from the detonation, tore through his face. It shattered his jaw and lodged in his shoulder. The commander of the German 7th Army went down in the mud, unable to speak, unable to issue orders, bleeding into the same Norman earth as the lowest private in his army. His staff was decimated around him. He was hauled onto the back of a tank, accounts say it was a Stug 3 assault gun, and strapped down and carried out of the pocket as he drifted in and out of consciousness. By August 21st, the Falaise Pocket was sealed. The 4th Canadian Armored Division linked with the Polish forces at Coudillard. The last escape routes were closed. What was left of the 7th Army either surrendered or was dead. The numbers are stark. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed inside the pocket. Another 50,000 were captured, marching in endless gray columns toward Allied prisoner cages with their hands behind their heads. The material losses were catastrophic in a way that numbers struggled to capture. Around 500 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned, approximately 7,000 trucks, and 20,000 horses, their bloated bodies filling the lanes and fields, creating a stench that persisted for weeks. The 12th SS Panzerjudent, one of the most feared units in the German order of battle, had lost 94% of its armor and 70% of its vehicles. Entire formations that had fought effectively for years had simply ceased to exist.
General Dwight Eisenhower toured the battlefield 2 days later, walking the same roads where Hausser's army had died. He was a man who had spent years dealing with the mathematics of warfare at the highest level. He was not easily disturbed, but what he saw at Falaise disturbed him deeply. He wrote in his memoirs that the battlefield was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any theater in the war, and that when he walked through it on foot, he encountered scenes that could only be described by Dante, that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The fear of disease became so acute that the French authorities officially designated the Falaise area an unhealthy zone. Paul Hausser survived his wounds.
He was evacuated from the pocket, jaw shattered, face torn open, strapped to a tank hull like cargo, and he recovered enough to take command of Army Group G in January 1945, though the war was already lost, and both he and everyone around him knew it. He surrendered to American forces at Zellum C in Austria in May 1945. He spent time in American captivity and then spent the rest of his long life, he died in 1972 at the age of 92, working to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS, arguing that it had been a military force like any other, that its soldiers had fought honorably, that the atrocities committed under SS auspices were the work of others. Historians have consistently rejected that account. But whatever one thinks of Hausser the man and his post-war activities, the lesson his army learned at Falaise was not about ideology or honor or military culture. It was about something far more fundamental. It was about what happens when one side brings a 19th century logistical system and a doctrine built on individual tactical excellence to a fight against an industrial nation that has decided to solve warfare as an engineering problem.
The German military tradition, from Frederick the Great through Moltke through the Blitzkrieg theorists, had always placed its faith in the quality of the individual soldier and the skill of the individual commander. The concept of Auftragtaktik, mission command, where junior officers were trusted to use their initiative to achieve objectives, produced remarkable tactical results. The Wehrmacht had repeatedly achieved victories against numerically superior opponents through superior flexibility and aggression. The belief in the superior fighting man, the Übermensch of the battlefield, ran deep through German military culture. At Falaise, the United States Army demonstrated that in industrial warfare, this belief is not a strength, it is a vulnerability. Because the individual soldier's initiative, his courage, his tactical genius, his instinctive dive for cover, all of these things had been anticipated by the engineers in the FDC tent and methodically engineered away. The TOT barrage removed the warning window that survival instinct depended on. The VT fuze removed the shelter that the foxhole had always provided. The Red Ball Express ensured that the guns never ran dry. And the Fire Direction Center, with its slide rules and synchronized watches and logarithm tables, turned the battlefield into a production floor. The men who built that system didn't hate their enemies. They didn't even particularly think about them. They thought about flight times and azimuth corrections and charge variance and barrel temperatures. They were accountants of destruction in clean uniforms, drinking hot coffee. And the army they were systematically eliminating could not understand what was killing it, because what was killing it wasn't a soldier at all. It was a system. And against a system optimized for destruction, individual courage, whatever its genuine worth as a human quality, is simply a variable in an equation. At Falaise, that equation produced 10,000 dead in a corridor the size of a city, 50,000 prisoners, and an Allied path to Paris that opened like a door. The Normandy campaign was over. The liberation of France followed within days. And somewhere in a Norman field, under the hot August sun, 20,000 horses decomposed alongside the shattered remnants of an army that had bet everything on the idea that fighting spirit could defeat factory output. History recorded the verdict without any ambiguity at all. If you found this story worth your time, consider subscribing to War Chronicles 1940, where we dig into the forgotten details, the human stories, and the sometimes brutal logic of the Second World War.
Drop a like if this is the kind of deep dive history you want to see more of. There are more stories like this one, stories where the decisive moment wasn't a single act of heroism, but a series of calculations made by men in tents far from the front, or a decision made by a general in the middle of the night to do the rational thing and defy a madman. This is where history actually lives. We'll see you in the next one.